Good evening, folks, and welcome back. This is Chris in Central Pennsylvania. In an article published just a couple hours ago by Reuters News Network regarding the refugee program in South Africa, some clarity and perhaps a hero in this, a villain? Perhaps not. Also, some topics are going to raise concern amongst impatient South Africans hoping to escape from South Africa under the refugee resettlement program to the United States. This article, entitled Exclusive, U.S. Diplomats Ask If Non-Whites Qualify for Trump Refugee Program for South Africans. It's actually a good topic to discuss. This is from Ted Hessen, Humaira Pamuk, and Christina Cook. In early July, the top official at the U.S. Embassy in South Africa reached out to Washington asking for clarification on contentious U.S. policy. Could non-whites apply for the program geared towards white South Africans if they met other requirements? Now, folks, this raises a profound question, one which I've raised many, many times since the very outset. How do we get to Afrikaners mentioned specifically in the February 7th executive order, which implied that Afrikaners would be a priority 2 group that would automatically be qualified as refugees simply for being an Afrikaner? How do we get from that to include other minorities? On February 7th, I also stated in my analysis that I hoped and expected that this program would include other racial minorities being discriminated against in South Africa, specifically coloreds and Indians, a point of contention with many white Afrikaans-speaking South Africans who seem to believe that Indians and coloreds, because they're technically under the law qualified for BE, are not discriminated against. But in practice, coloreds and Indians are discriminated against massively in South Africa, denied contracts and tenders, denied bursaries for education. The mere fact that they are ceremoniously included in BE as being black doesn't mean they're treated as black by the ANC. Now, the U.S. Embassy website posted information about the executive order on the 10th of February, and that post included the term ethnic minorities, setting off a debate about who that would include. Then nothing more about the program until May 12th, when the program went live on the Embassy website, when I was sitting at OR Tambo in Wimpy's eating breakfast, and I posted a video about this. The following criteria were listed since May 12th to qualify. You must be South African nationality, must be of Afrikaner ethnicity, or be a member of a racial minority in South Africa, and must be able to articulate a past experience of persecution or fear of future persecution. Now, the major developments in those criteria that differed from the executive order is the inclusion of racial minorities and the requirement to articulate past persecution or fear of future persecution. The executive order gives a clear implication that it's implied, having identified Afrikaners as being at risk, specifically in offering refugee status to them, that Trump was intending to consider them as a priority 2. Now, pay no attention to the concept of priority 1, 2, 3, and 4. It isn't really a priority. It's simply a categorization of types of refugees. Priority 2 is an automatic grouping. So, for instance, I'll give you an example here. If we gave priority status to gays in the Middle East, in predominantly Muslim countries, like, for instance, in Syria, where homosexuals are thrown from the roof to their death, the mere fact that you're homosexual, in this case, would put you in a group that puts you at risk. And as a consequence, you would need protection. So in this case, Afrikaners, in the executive order, it appears that they're being identified as a priority 2 grouping. However, when the program was announced on May 12th, that wasn't the case. Now you must, as the law normally says for most people, you must be able to articulate a past experience of persecution or fear of future persecution. That and the fact that other racial minorities were included were the 2 major developments. In a diplomatic cable sent on July 8th, Embassy Chargé d'Affaires David Green asked whether the embassy could process claims from other minority groups claiming race-based discrimination, such as the coloreds, who speak Afrikaans mostly. And the answer came back days later in an email from Spencer Chrétien, the highest-ranking official in the State Department's Refugee and Migration Bureau, saying the program is intended for white people. Wow. Is he a villain? I don't know. Spencer Chrétien is not a person I do know, but I do know he's involved in many conservative activities. Senior bureau official in the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Previously, Spencer was a political appointee at the Department of Housing and Urban Development and worked at conservative nonprofits in Washington. In the first Trump administration, he served as special assistant to the president and associate director of presidential personnel from 2020 to 2021, and as a political appointee at the Department of Housing and Urban Development from 2019 to 2020. He's from Northern Virginia and is a graduate of the College of William & Mary. Now, this looks like one of those typical DC folks that gloms onto politics and gets promoted because they hang out in think tanks, whether it's liberal or conservative. And these tend to be the people who get these political appointments, not those who are out in the field who have the experience. Now, the Reuters reporters state that they've been unable to independently verify the language in Chrétien's email, which was described to Reuters by 3 different sources familiar with the contents of the email, lending serious credibility to it. In response to Reuters' request for information, the State Department said U.S. policy is to consider both Afrikaners and other racial minorities for resettlement, echoing the guidance posted on its website back in May, saying that applicants must be of Afrikaner ethnicity or be a member of a racial minority, which is what we've been saying since May 12th. And I've been saying I hope would be the answer since February 7th. Now, I'm glad that Reuters has the gravitas to get answers from the Department of State. My official media request to the Department of State, whom I've worked with extensively for the past 2 decades, my official request for information have gone unanswered since February. Foggy Bottom has lived up to its name regarding President Trump's refugee program. Opaque, not transparent. Apparently, Chrétien declined to comment through a State Department spokesperson, and Green did not respond to any requests from Reuters as well. Now, the internal back and forth between the Embassy and State Department, which had not previously been reported by anybody, illustrates the confusion in how to implement a policy designed to help white Afrikaners in a racially diverse country that includes mixed-race people who speak Afrikaans, as well as whites who speak English. And that's an assessment by the authors, one which I disagree with. That's their assessment, what they believe is happening. It appears to me, based on the limited information we have, that a political appointee is interjecting himself into the process illegitimately. Could be wrong, but that appears to be the case. Now, in what will no doubt distress many refugee aspirants and inspire the haters, Reuters reports here from State Department sources that the original cohort of 59 has grown to only 88 refugees to date. So that would mean since May 12th, July 12th, well over a month, we've had only an additional 19 people come over. Now, that's far less than my sources have implied and puts the figure at 20 to 30 fewer refugees than my own estimates. I will state that the figure of 88 is most likely very accurate. It appears that Reuters has good sourcing inside the Department of State, as I have myself been working on partial and incomplete data thus far. I would also note that folks need not panic. For a variety of reasons, including funding, end of the fiscal year, President Trump's previous suspension of the entire refugee program, and other reasons, the pace was likely to be slow at this stage and will pick up in the next fiscal year, which begins October 1st. Now, Reuters also indicates that already 15 additional South African refugees are expected to arrive by the end of August. Well, by the end of August, that's quite a ways off. And that would be very disappointing to those who believed and bought into the Washington Post article. Yeah, that may be true, but it conflicts with the previous Washington Post claim that 1,000 South Africans will arrive in the U.S. by 30 September. Now, I was skeptical of that previous Washington Post article report when it came out. The Reuters story would mean that I was correct to be skeptical. Now, since the executive order, U.S. diplomats working to implement the program have been deliberating internally about which groups could be considered eligible, according to one of the sources Reuters has. The July 8th cable, the Charge d'Affaires Green laid out a summary of the different ethnic and racial groups in the country before seeking guidance on eligibility. In addition to Afrikaners and mixed-race South Africans, coloreds, he mentioned indigenous South Africans known as the Khoisan people, another group that I said should be eligible for this. He also said that members of the Jewish community had expressed interest, but that South Africa are considered a religious minority, not a racial group. In the absence of other guidance, the embassy intends to give consideration to well-founded claims of persecution based on race for other racial minorities, which is the advice that Green gave, the Charge d'Affaires. Now, folks, given that Jews in the diaspora are most often considered white by non-Jews, in the South African context, they would not need to qualify for religious persecution, but rather could qualify from racial persecution. The July 8th State Department cable, which is a routine means of official communication within the Department of State and to other agencies, a cable, would appear to be a landmark decision and a bold one on the part of Charge d'Affaires Green, a highly regarded career Foreign Service officer who recently arrived from Nigeria to take up the number 2 post in Pretoria, but is running the show in the absence of a confirmed U.S. ambassador. Ambassador designee Brent Bozell has yet to be confirmed by the Senate and not in South Africa. Now, Reuters says the cable forced the administration to clarify its position on whether the policy is for whites only, and if it does include other aggrieved minorities, who would qualify, according to 2 people familiar with this issue. So where does President Trump come down to this topic? Since people under him are debating it back and forth. When asked about this program back in May, Trump said he was not giving Afrikaners preferential treatment because they're white. Specifically, he said they happen to be white, but whether they're white or black makes no difference to me. Now, in response to a request for comment, a White House official said the administration's policy reflected Trump's executive order. Now, you may be asking yourself, how, when it specifically noted Afrikaners, is that true? Trump mentioned racial discrimination in several categories, including education, under the law, business, and so on, all of which apply to all racial minorities. So there's no incongruity present here between the executive order and the current state of the refugee program, making any racial minority potentially eligible for refugee status. We will prioritize refugee admissions for South African citizens, including Afrikaners and other racial minorities in South Africa who have been targeted by the discriminatory laws of the South African government, according to one official. So there you have it, folks. Done and dusted, finished and clear. Time for the rest of the legacy media, social media prima donnas, and South African politicians to stop lying about this program. It is not a program for whites. It is not a program for Afrikaners. It is not a program for farmers. Good Lord, it's not for farmers. It's a program for any of those people who meet the category and the qualifications. Most of the people I just mentioned would meet that status, but it also includes others, potentially Khoisan, coloreds, and Indians, as I've said all along. There does appear to be at least someone in the Trump administration who is saying something in conflict with this. But in practice, that's not what's happening right now. What's happening right now is that they are processing any and all racial minorities who claim they've suffered from unjust racial persecution. This is an interesting story from Reuters, and I want to tip my hat to them for going out of the way. Now, there's a few things in the article that I don't agree with, but life isn't perfect, and just because I agree doesn't mean I'm right, or that they're wrong, or they're right, or that I'm wrong. Anyway, folks, there you have it. There's my analysis of the Reuters article, and I'm glad that they put this out there because I think it's an important question to address. What say you, South Africa? What say you, America? This affects us. Cheers, folks.